Hello, everybody. This stream originally aired February 21st, 2021, and this is the first stream in the Fire in the Mountain Corporate Greed in Appalachia lecture series. In this lecture series, I introduce myself and I introduce a little bit on the topic of Appalachia, what Appalachia is. Thanks for showing up for my very, very first lecture, and I'm looking forward to everything that we're going to cover in the future. Make sure you check out my streams. They are every Sunday at 10:30 in the evening. And without any further ado, let's get into it. So you guys didn't see that. All right, so let's get started. As you can see, I have a knack for engaging in interesting PowerPoint design. I'm Jacob. So who am I? Why am I somebody that is good to talk about this? So as I was saying in my little brief intro, I graduated App State fall 2019, and these are my credos. My background's in foreign service and national security, with a large focus in not only Appalachian studies, but Judaic, Holocaust, and peace studies. One of the things that I got to college, because you always get to college, and you get to that point of, why am I in this class? More importantly, why am I enjoying this? And for me, unfortunately, that was genocide. I took a bunch of classes on genocide, and I thought it was just incredibly interesting. It was fascinating to study. It was dark and depressing, and there were definitely nights whenever it was a little hard to sleep after class, but it's something that not a lot of people study for that reason, and it's a very worthwhile thing to study. But one of the big things that you're going to hear me say on these streams more than anything is I am not an expert. As much as I'd like to be one, and as much as I might believe myself to be an expert on some things, I'm not. I have a bachelor's level education. I do my own independent research, and honestly, if I was paying a bunch of money to do that research, it would probably count towards a bachelor's degree pretty easily. But I don't have the I'm not peer reviewed enough to call myself an expert, and there are a lot of things that I don't know. But I believe that history is a discussion. History is supposed to be a discussion, because if you want to be incredibly cynical about it, we can look back at history, and it's really difficult to prove that anything with certainty happened. And you have so many people in history that are so certain that their read on it is the right read. And I mean, we prove historians wrong all the time. I mean, some people are easier to prove wrong than others. There was a Byzantine historian who, Procopius, he wrote The Secret History, and his read on his current affairs was that the Empress, the wife of the reigning emperor, she wasn't actually the ruler, was a demon that was sent here to lead him astray. It wasn't that he was a bad ruler, it was that his wife is evil and corrupting him. Now, unfortunately, not all bad historians are that easy to take down, for the most part. But, history is supposed to be a discussion, and by us all talking about it, we can get so much closer to what actually probably happened, instead of calling people demons. And I just want to do a brief... You say that you didn't really like history whenever you were in school. What is it? How does it work? So history runs off of two types of sources for the most part. Primary and secondary sources. Both of these right here are primary sources. I'll let that sink in for a second. On the left here, you have White House correspondence. It's a paper trail. We can track down events because we can prove on paper that they happened. The other part of that, other flip side of that primary source coin, is the primary sources themselves typically have a lot of bias. And it's our job as good historians that are reasonable and balanced to look at it and say, I don't think they were telling the truth. Why didn't they tell the truth? What are they trying to accomplish here? And once you identify that bias, you can really think about it and be like, yeah, They have a point, you know? Okay, they weren't telling the truth, but this is what we can glean from their perspective. And secondary sources are with this podcast slash Twitch stream. It is people that are analyzing primary sources and contemporary secondary sources and trying to make sense of it all. Secondary sources are obviously much more biased, like the news media and even modern. These are both, or at least I can speak for the Book on the Right. The Book on the Right's a fantastic history of the Crusades. It is probably the most unbiased account that I've ever heard of the most biased event in history. But on the left, you can see that in the Library of Congress, they scan every newspaper that's in current circulation. They scan it in because one day, honestly, not that far in the future, all of the stuff that we're reading on the internet and especially in print, that's going to be viewed as a secondary source to look at how we lived our lives. It's terrifying, is it not? And we have to look back with that same cynicism. We have to look back and see that the media has always had an agenda. The media's agenda is always to sell more copies, get more clicks. So whenever we look back and we're like, oh my gosh, this newspaper explains it perfectly, this was so exciting, we really have to take a minute and be like, it probably wasn't that exciting. But talking about biases, being 100% open and honest with this, I have put together a list of my implicit and explicit biases. You might want to take a screen recording of this, because I do not like to admit fault. You can ask my fiance. So there's a difference between biases, and I'm a really good candidate to show this. An implicit bias is one that the person that is speaking is not aware of. And an explicit bias is something that that person is absolutely aware of. Let's start with my implicit biases, because those are less fun. I'm a practicing Lutheran. I am a Christian, so that's definitely going to color the way that I look at Christianity, for sure. And beyond that, I was born and have lived my entire life in Western North Carolina. Now, with today's topic, that's a little bit more important than it would be if we were looking at, say, the Holocaust. The lens that I see things through is a lens that is Appalachian in nature, but later we're going to talk about how that doesn't exist. And you know, I have a bias because I haven't got to see most of the wide world. I don't have that great worldly impression. That being said, I've left the U.S. less than 10 times in my life, which I'm working on changing, but it's expensive in COVID. I grew up in the lower middle class. I am definitely no longer in the lower middle class. I am a little bit closer to the lower class now. I am definitely going to have a read on things that is against the wealthy. But on the flip side of that, my favorite author is Tom Clancy. So growing up reading all of his books, I definitely received a lot of indoctrination that you should definitely trust the intelligence services and that the government fundamentally tries to be good, which I'm fighting that bias. But, and the media that we consume is a bias to us all. Looking at video games, intelligence thrillers, crime thrillers, I definitely like to look at the rogues in history as possibly a good force when realistically the rogues in history were probably assholes. Now, my explicit biases, all of this is up for read. I can't read my own implicit biases that well because they are mine. If you can already find some of them, go ahead and drop them in the chat along with any questions you might have. Because I need to be more aware of my biases. Miranda, be gentle. My explicit biases. These are things that I believe and I'm upfront and aware of that I believe. Whenever we look at history, I believe that morality is the tertiary goal. If we look back in history with the goal of saying, well, this person wasn't a great person, we're going to be able to say that about damn near everybody. We can, I mean, if we're looking even at beloved figures from our history, like Abraham Lincoln is a nice, safe one. Lincoln was kind of an asshole. If you look at his correspondence, he never intended to free slaves. It was just a means to an end for him. And if we go back trying to say, okay, well, Lincoln was an asshole because really he didn't want to change anything. He just felt like it was the easiest way to win the war. We look at Lincoln differently. But if we look at history pragmatically and trying to figure out why things happen, we can see that Lincoln freed the slaves because he believed that it would give the North the moral advantage over the South and make sure that no countries came to the South's rescue, which was an incredibly, incredibly rational way to proceed. Uh, and also, leaving morality out of things really makes us better historians because we're able to. Yes, being white and male is absolutely an implicit bias. That absolutely goes without saying because, well, I'm using Abraham Lincoln as a example. Whenever they're definitely more. Uh, there are definitely better examples that explain the point better, but I definitely wanted to go with what is safe as a historian. Um, but moving on beyond that, my next explicit bias, which is definitely against the first one. I believe there's never a good excuse for genocide, which I would like to think that all historians and humans should believe. But that's whenever you look at genocide as a phenomena, there are definitely a lot of historians, especially on the inside of perpetrator nations, that are like, no, 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 they had it coming. This is a rational way to proceed and proceed. It never is. I'm also anti-war. Uh, I I think that while war is necessary at times, war should never be our first option. I don't think that war is good. We should never glorify it. I believe that women are definitely the equal of men, and that gender and sexuality are a spectrum. These all influence my reads of history, but I believe they make me a better person. And my biggest implicit bias, or my biggest explicit bias, period, that you are never going to hear me actually discuss on this channel because it is that large, is I definitely um, am very passionate about the Armenian genocide as something in history. I believe that it absolutely happened. I believe that you can back it up that it actually happened. And I believe that it's still being denied to this day. Now, that being said, me having this much of a bias on it, I steer very well clear of it. Um, but that's me. And this is a shot of my hometown of Lenore, North Carolina. I don't live there anymore, but it's a big part of who I am. And I wanted to end with something nice and pretty. So, let's actually switch over to what all of you came here for. That being said, I do have to switch presentations. As always, if you have any questions, drop them into the stream chat. I've definitely gotten a couple Snapchats and Facebook messages already. I love you all, but if I'm checking my social media while I'm talking, we're never going to finish this, ever. I'm very easily distracted. So what is Appalachia? Appalachia is very close to my heart. Appalachia is my home. It is probably one of the most beautiful places in the entire world. Looking at it geologically, Appalachia and the Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountains in history. They stretch all the way from northwestern Alabama, and many people would argue that they stretch all the way across the ocean to Scotland, following the undersea rises and geological formations. And for this reason, Appalachia is very rich. We are rich in soil, we are rich in minerals, and we're rich in culture. I would argue, especially as an academic, Appalachian culture is more of a myth, a put on, but we're going to get into that. So, in my own personal model, I see that there are four main phases in the settlement of Appalachia. And a lot of people would argue that there are more like three. But I believe that the first one's the one that we definitely leave out the most whenever it comes to what Appalachia is, because it's very easy to think that Appalachia has always been here. There have always been people here, and it hasn't. Appalachia was settled pretty late in humanity's journey around the world, because it is in the Americas. Sorry. The Native Americans got their start in roughly Alaska, whenever the land bridge connected the two continents, and they expanded from there. Appalachia being on the opposite side of the continent, as well as being a mountain climate, it took them a while to really think, this would be a great place to live. But Appalachia's in a temperate zone, and Appalachia's just bouquet of plants and animals really made the early hunter-gathering cultures, and that would very, very quickly begin living agrarian lifestyles. It was a paradise for them. Yeah, absolutely, it gets cold here in the winter, but Appalachia's ecosystem is really well suited to sustenance farming and hunting, which is why you still see people today hunting and farming Appalachia as a way of life. Hunting less so because of the horrendous damage that we've done to the ecosystem, but if I start on that vein, I'm never gonna finish. But from 1688 until 1776, you see the peripheries, and I do have a little bit of bone to pick with this idea, but you typically see people settling in Appalachia that are borderline anarchists or just want to be left alone. You also see people that can't afford land moving to where land is not, where you don't buy the land, you claim the land. And this is because there was a proclamation line that existed for the entire colonial period of the Americas, where it was literally just a line in the sand that was saying, everything on this side, sorry, my camera reverses things, everything on this side belongs to the Native Americans. We won't cross this line. We won't settle here. Everything on this side is colonial interests. If Native Americans come over to this side, they have to observe our culture. Now, that being said, they were here first. It was a horrible thing for us to do. But this system worked for them for a long time. Whenever land started getting scarce, of course, prices for land skyrocketed, taxes for land skyrocketed. People started being like, well, we don't even know what's on the other side of those mountains. There has to be more space. There has to be more land for us. And people started crossing that line. This led to many, many wars with native tribes, native nations, I'm sorry, to the point that eventually the British military had to get involved and settle this. Now, speaking of the British military getting involved in settling things, flash forward to 1776, there is a war that we will talk about eventually. And you might have heard of it, called the American Revolution. And that threw Appalachia into just almost anarchy. Appalachia, for the most part, was very sympathetic to nobody. They did not pick a side. They just wanted to be left the hell alone, because on one side you have a bunch of people from northeastern cities and industrial centers that are saying, hey, our rights are important. They're oppressing us. And on the other side you have people saying, you have taxes that need to be paid. Well, Appalachians at this time weren't big on paying taxes and weren't big on getting involved in other people's schemes, so Appalachia stayed away from most of it. Unless we really want to talk about Kings Mountain, and we will get to that later. But roughly around 1780, everything has calmed down. The nation has kind of found a national identity and starts westward expansion. And this westward expansion lasts beyond 1860, obviously. But this westward expansion, as it pertains to Appalachia, is mostly from the 1780s to the 1860s. This is when people go into the mountains, they stake their claims, and you have the families that still exist in Appalachia really forming. I know that my oldest ancestors in the mountains I have traced back to the 1770s. And that was started by none other than a Hessian mercenary who defected from the British, went off into the mountains to never be heard from again, started a family that eventually led to me, which is why I have this wonderful pasty white skin and red beard. But, looking beyond that, in the 1860s, we see corporations and extractive industry really starting to move into Appalachia. They see this large workforce that is ready to be mined, no horrible pun not intended, and it fundamentally changes how Appalachia functions. That is really the last stage of settlement in Appalachia. From that point on, Appalachia is on track to catch up to the rest of the world, and it becomes an industrialized center. And we're going to go with a more artistic approach for the rest of this, because I want to be able to answer questions and just this be more like a conversation and less like a lecture, because you're not paying me. So you shouldn't get that wonderful elitism that comes with professorships. The first thing I really want to talk about is the Scots-Irish and who actually settled Appalachia. So, it is a long-standing myth that the Ulster Scots, the Scots that were pushed out of Scotland to find ready land in Northern Ireland and turn North Ireland Protestant, are the people that founded Appalachia. And there is a tiny, tiny little silver lining of truth to that. I myself can't deny it because part of my family is the Buchanan family, and the Buchanan family are unabashedly Scots-Irish. But even the term Scots-Irish is an American invention. In Europe, they are more likely to be called the Ulster Scots, and if you look at the Buchanan family's website, because they actually have one, they're still a mildly important family. Most of them still live in Scotland and Ireland. For the most part, they didn't come over here. Now, looking on my mom's side of the family, we absolutely have to admit that they did come over here. And it is the same family. But for the most part, Appalachia wasn't settled by the Scots-Irish. So who actually settled them? There's a huge, huge German population in Appalachia. And if you look at the faith breakdown between Appalachian churches, you're going to see a lot of Lutheran churches. You're going to see a higher statistic of Lutheran and Moravian churches in and around Appalachia than you see in most of the East Coast. Why is that? Well, if you look back into the 1700s, the Anglican Church is now a thing. But otherwise, if you're coming out of Europe, you're probably Catholic. And if you're going to set up in those cultural hubs, especially in New York, or New Orleans, or any of the big cities, you're not going to fit in within your culture if you're not a Catholic. So the cast-offs, the people that didn't fit in, went to Appalachia because there they were free to practice their beliefs. So you have Moravians, which were one of the oldest Catholic heresies. They came out of Jan Hus's Hussites, and they are honestly one of the earliest organized Protestant groups. Then you have the Lutherans, and Lutherans were definitely taking over Germany by the time that American colonialism started. But again, you move where people are friendly to you, and it was convenient for a lot of Lutherans to move to the mountains where they could practice their beliefs without any stigma. And of course, we would see America turn into a Protestant nation. But beyond all of this, Appalachia is a melting pot, because cheap land is a universal language. If you didn't have the money to buy a big plot of land and start your tobacco plantation in eastern North Carolina, or looking north up towards New Hampshire and northern Appalachia, if you didn't have the money to set up your business, you moved where land was cheap. And America being what it is, a melting pot of all cultures, eventually these cultural ties started to melt away, and that's why it's so hard to ethnographically look at Appalachia and decide, well, these people are obviously from here, because very quickly the people that moved to the mountains ended up supporting each other. So, what I wanted to talk about, because I want to frame this background towards what we're going to be talking about next week, which is the West Virginia Mine Wars. The first instance of Appalachians rising up in unison to fight together was the Over Mountain Men. And at the Battle of Cowpens, Nathaniel Greensboro's named after him, would stop the British advance. Why was he so successful? It wasn't just because he was a good general. He was a pretty good general, but a large part of the British military broke off and headed towards Kings Mountain to fight what they thought would be a Patriot contingent there. Now, most of these were American volunteers on both sides of this battle, but you have what are known as the Over Mountain Men, which have reached a mythical status. Honestly, I couldn't tell you how true modern depictions are of them, because there's not a lot that was written about this. It's mostly passed down in oral tradition. So the Over Mountain Men came across the mountains. They were the people that were living over that proclamation line. And at the Battle of Kings Mountain, they would come together under General Lenore, who the city of Lenore, if anybody who actually knows me is where I'm from, is named after. And they would surround the British position on Kings Mountain and move in slowly and trying to capture the British officer in charge, who would eventually be killed, saying that he would never leave the mountain, and he was shot retreating, so that wasn't true, but he is still buried on top of the mountain, so he has yet to leave the mountain. But looking at this from a history perspective, looking at this and trying to fit its importance into the narrative of Appalachia, Kings Mountain is one of the first times that you see the outside world interacting with these people who, for the most part, have kept to themselves pretty happily. And it is because the British were wanting to enforce the proclamation line. And as much as it is a stain on Appalachia's character, well, the first time that we rose up in unison about something was to essentially tell the overarching government that, hey, we realize what you're doing here, but we're not going to. We need this land more than they do, which is awful. It's colonialism at its heart. And it really shows that while Appalachia, modern scholars look at Appalachia under colonialism, an internal colonialism model. And back in the day, though, Appalachia were the colonizers, and the one thing that they were willing to band together and fight for was that they could colonize Native American land, which is depressing. But if you're coming to my stream for uplifting history, I'll do my best, but I'm not gonna promise anything. I am a genocide historian. This leads to the culture of Appalachia. If you just type into Google Appalachian culture and you look for the good scholarly academic articles, most of them are going to be wrong. I'm not saying that as an Appalachian who thinks that he knows things better. I'm saying this is somebody that studied this, and the one thing that most academics can agree on about Appalachia is that we don't understand it. Appalachia is almost, it's like a mystery. It is this portion of a society, a mostly white but not entirely white society, that appears different from all those around it. But really that read comes from everybody treating it differently. It was in the 1860s, whenever people first started writing about Appalachia from the outside in. And you have the local color movement where we get the first read of Appalachia, which is the culture of poverty. And still to this day, Appalachia is hurt every day by what was written in that. Because people, missionaries from New York, and even early fledgling academics in the field, they looked at Appalachia and they were like, well, these people have been poor since this land was settled. These people have created a culture of poverty. They don't want to work, which is wrong. Appalachians are some of the hardest working people I know. But starting in 1860, you have people coming in saying, well, you're lazy, so we're going to give you some money and teach you how to work. And Appalachia is really... Appalachia is a study in the phenomena of unintended consequence. Because people come into Appalachia thinking, okay, we're going to do so much about this, we're going to help these people. And typically they make it worse. You're going to hear me complain a whole lot about the war on poverty and how it was just idiotic. Because the war on poverty really made Appalachians dependent on the government. And this is because they're trying to find this uniquely Appalachian solution to things. And they're like, well, they're lazy. They're not willing to hold down a job. So let's subsidize work there. And so you have coal companies, logging companies come in, and they're like, oh, we heard cheap labor. The government will pay us to employ these people, and we're also going to pay them starvation wages, oftentimes with not even real money. And that's one of the main reasons that Appalachia is still poor to this day, is companies and the government really took advantage of what Appalachians had. For so many people, it was easy votes, and for the others, it was easy money. So whenever I talk about Appalachian culture, we really have to keep this in mind, that talking about Appalachian culture is the reason that Appalachia has a different culture. But at the same time, it's looking at Appalachia. You can drive through some of the communities in Appalachia. I'm not talking about Boone, North Carolina. I'm not talking about Asheville. They don't exist if we are talking about Appalachia as a region. If you drive through some of the normal communities in Appalachia, it is hard to not see. Appalachia is different. And we're definitely lying to ourselves if we don't acknowledge this as a beautiful thing. We start seeing Appalachia as holding on to a sustenance farming lifestyle long before, because nobody messed with Appalachia. Appalachia didn't mess with anybody. There is a good contentment that comes out of the region. It was families and communities that would band together, and there would be a very, very small amount of cash flow in these communities. But these communities operated off of barter systems, working together. You would have barn raisings, church raisings, baby showers. It'd be parties for weddings. I'm not saying that it was a utopia, because it wasn't. These people were still poor. Finished goods didn't come in. But people made what they needed. And Appalachia was definitely a different place before industrialism took hold. But looking at that, it's easy to read that Appalachia is primitive. But I want to offer an argument against that. In Appalachia, in especially pre-1860s Appalachia, while there was a gender divide, men and women had roughly the same expectations of each other. Women were supposed to work on the farm, because if the entire family wasn't pulling together, these family farms were going to collapse. Women would have their own trades. And looking at other places in the country at this time, excuse me, especially coming into the 1860s, we really see that at this point, we have a heavily gendered society in most of the country. In 1860s, we see the first women's suffrage movements come along. We see the first women's rights movements come along. When in Appalachia, there was a large attitude of contentment because women had not an equal place in society, but a much more equal place in the rest of society. So this myth of a good old boys culture in Appalachia it's definitely something that we have kind of forced in. It exists today only because it was expected to exist, and it really came in with the rise of industrialization. And I've already touched on religion, showing that Appalachia is incredibly religiously diverse, and at the same time, it isn't. If you look at Protestants, it's incredibly diverse because Appalachia has a lot of Protestants in it. It has just about every flavor of Protestant that you can find, which is fantastic for somebody like me that is really curious about these things. I was able to grow up going to a Baptist church, a Lutheran church, Methodist church. I've even been to Moravian services at this point. Looking at Boone, there was a Jewish temple there as well. But the one thing that you don't see in Appalachia is you don't see a lot of Catholicism. Because most of the people that settled Appalachia, if not all of the people that settled Appalachia back in the day, were Protestants. But that leads me to an interesting talking point about today. Today, if you look at a roster of the people that work in Appalachia and the people that live here for the majority of the growing season and the harvesting season, especially for Christmas trees, you see that Appalachia has a burgeoning Hispanic population. And with that, you see the interesting phenomena of Appalachian Catholic churches, which are a beautiful thing. They don't have a lot of that Appalachian spirit because they are catering to a population that is immigrating from somewhere else. But there is overlap. You definitely do have locals that are curious that will end up becoming Catholics, and it leads to a modern manifestation of that melting pot. We can trust somebody that's here more than somebody that's not here, because somebody that's here is more likely to understand us. So you see Appalachians adopting, once again, another population in. And it's much harder today with the racism that's currently in our country, and the fact that Appalachia's incredibly painted and expected to be this very right-wing racist place, where in reality it's not. But it's definitely harder for this melting pot to work today. And let's talk about this farming, this agrarian society. There was and always has been industry in Appalachia. Until the 1860s, Appalachia produced more pork than any other region in the United States. But there wasn't an easy way to get products made in Appalachia outside of Appalachia. And in that way, with the exception of pork and lumber, Appalachia has always served itself with its industry. So you see so many pictures like this coming out of Appalachia, especially early Appalachia, where you have people working farms by hand to produce what is needed for their family and a small bumper crop, which leads to the mythical moonshiners of Appalachia turning just about any fermentable substance into whiskey, which is completely overstated in modern society. But you see a large agrarian society. And early Appalachia up until the 1860s, and honestly parts of Appalachia even today, are still heavily reliant on agriculture. There is great soil in Appalachia, but whenever population exploded around the mid 19th century, you started seeing that they couldn't rotate crops as easily, and Appalachians all of a sudden weren't able to farm land anymore. Couple that with the rise of outside industrialism, and you have a recipe for disaster. So, and this is my last point, and this is going to lead into next week. You have these outside companies, coal companies, logging companies, and if you look at Lenore, North Carolina, you actually see an interesting corollary, but I'll finish with that. You see that outside companies come in and they see that Appalachia has extractive industry potential. In the 1860s, when the tourism boom hit Appalachia, believe it or not, we've been a tourist destination for 150 years now. Uh, Plus or minus. There were some gaps in there. But in the 1860s, there was a huge tourism boom in Appalachia, and you have these titans of industry coming through, taking geological samples as they go, because, nobody ever actually goes on vacation. We always have to bring work with us somehow. They realized that Appalachia could be mined for everything from coal, or if you look around Boone, North Carolina, and Asheville, North Carolina, most of the mines, there were some iron mines, but most of the mines came mining minerals to make soap and cleaning products. Everybody looked at these old mountains and were like, they're full of usable things. And there's this workforce that's just sitting around waiting for us to come in and give them jobs. And that didn't go very well because Appalachians weren't used to this industrialized society. Appalachians wanted a lot more freedom than industrialism offers. And they weren't, it's not that they didn't want to work, they just were unfamiliar with it. Family came first. And there's a story, and this is probably one of the best stories I've heard that wasn't from a family member, of a man whose job has been getting paid pennies on the hour, and his job was to take a wheelbarrow full of dirt, toss it off the side of a cliff when they were building the parkway. Well, every time he would go over to the cliff, he would dump his wheelbarrow, and then he'd look over it, and just watch the dirt roll down the side of the cliff. And eventually the foreman looked at him and he said, if you hurried, you could grab another thing of dirt and just chase that first one down with it. And you could watch them both go down, trying to get the man to be a little bit more industrious. So then the worker looks over at the foreman and says, "You know what I also could watch go down the hill?" "What?" And he pushes the wheelbarrow off the side of the cliff and goes home. Or headed to the house, as the original telling says. And it's... Appalachia's always had a rebel streak. It's always had our way comes first. And you see that in these early industrial jobs, as people would go long enough to get what they needed for their family, and then they would go back home to the family unit. But whenever that strain really starts to hit, whenever that land is not as good as it used to be, whenever it's just harder to make that way of life than it used to be, typically because the barter system was destroyed by people coming in with cheap goods and cheap stores, Appalachia all of a sudden becomes a hard place to make it without a job. And when we hit that point, we see industrialization, and the handful of industries are in any place, sometimes the only industry that is in one place, completely overtake Appalachia. And the poverty rate goes from, manageable to people are dying. And it's that early industrialization of Appalachia that pushes us to our darkest hour as a people. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week. We're going to be talking about the West Virginia Mine Wars, and specifically my work as a historian when I looked at the Matewan Massacre leading into the Battle of Blair Mountain. And I'm going to have a long discussion about Matewan, West Virginia, and how the violence there eventually kicked off the largest civil unrest since the Civil War. And you're going to have all kinds of characters like the Hatfields and the McCoys coming into play with this, which I would love to say is an invention of mine to tell the story more interestingly. But Sid Hatfield was the chief of police in Matewan, West Virginia. This is after the Hatfield-McCoy feud, but that family still had a lot of influence. Not as much as they would have today, but we're going to look at how violence erupted, why violence erupted, and how it changed things or really didn't change things. But I promise to leave everything on a happier note. And if you're actually from the region, you're not going to see this as a happier note. But Appalachia defying defying classification as it always does, would go on to harbor its own industry. And looking at the end of the Civil War and the need for industrialization in Appalachia, because you have this large influx of cash from the Civil War, you have the rise of cottage industry. And in some places, cottage industry was a little bit more well suited. I have a friend who's an expert on Appalachian railroads, and I would love to have him on and explain why industry took off in some places and didn't in others, and how the railroad shaped that. But long story short, Lenore, North Carolina was well suited to have its own industry. And one hardware store that also made furniture on the side at the end of the Civil War exploded into the largest furniture industry in the world that started out of Lenore, North Carolina. Companies like Kincaid, Bernhardt, Broyhill, which would eventually become furniture brands and then go under, all started in Lenore, North Carolina. And their factories are still there to this day, even though they're not running, because they outsourced, yada, yada, yada. But Appalachia wasn't all outside industry. There are towns in Appalachia that, for the majority of this period that we're looking at on the slide, would go on to make their own fortunes. They would start their own industry that was owned by people in Appalachia and create jobs for entire regions. So, what I want to leave you with here today is, whenever we're discussing Appalachia for this first set of lectures, I really want to challenge you to say it is not all. Appalachia is not a monolith. Appalachia is diverse and varied, like any region in the United States. And while it may look dark on one side, it's always happy in another. And I really want to challenge the academia one day that Appalachia might not exist. Everybody wants us to exist. Everybody wants Appalachia to exist for one reason or another. Maybe it's to make money, maybe it's to get votes, or maybe people just want to believe in a fundamentally American minority. And by American I mean white. But Appalachia doesn't exist. Appalachia is just as diverse as the rest of the nation. And the only reason that Appalachia looks any different is because it's treated differently. So while we look at Appalachia as a subset, just think about the fact that maybe, just maybe, Appalachia is no different than the rest of us, because we can find examples just like Appalachia all over the world. But that's it. I hope this was a great introduction to what Appalachia is and isn't. And I'll stick around for a little while if anybody has any questions. But that's the end of the lecture. So thank you all for coming. This is probably the highest turnout I think I've ever had on a stream, which makes me smile. Thank you to my new followers. It makes me so incredibly happy. You can follow me on social media below. And I hope that everybody has a fantastic evening or night. This is my morning, so good luck to everybody else that has to go to sleep now. But y'all have a great night. All right. If there's no questions, y'all have a great night. I might get on Twitch later and stream a video game, but we might just be calling it a night. And getting some rest on my one day off a week. Y'all have a great day.